Those songs. It's so good to be here. I hate the red tide. My throat has been scratchy all morning because of it, but excuse me, I love the beach. I love the beach atmosphere. There's a lot of stuff here. There's just a lot of things in Destin. Like driving down the street, I've never seen so many like gift shops in my life. Like it blew my mind. I was like, there's Alvin's here, and there's Alvin's here, and there's Alvin's here. Like it's wild. And so I think, man, there's just a ton of money. Yesterday I went driving around and just driving through some random neighborhoods. And so if you saw this white vehicle creeping through your neighborhood, it was probably me. But there's some really nice houses here. But the thing that's probably the most valuable here that I've come to know this weekend are the people. My wife and I have had the opportunity of spending a lot of time with several of the members here this weekend, having good food and good fellowship. And so if you're visiting, I just encourage you to take a moment and to get away from all of the stuff of Destin and just get a moment and have a moment with the people here, because you'll find that that's probably one of the most valuable things that you can have here. And my wife and I were just so thankful for the opportunity just to be here and get to meet the people here and to share in this experience. Thinking about coming to Destin, if you got your Bibles, turn to Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4. Thinking about coming to Destin, the last time I was here, last time my wife and I were here together was just a little over 2 years ago. A little over 2 years ago is August, and we went to Seaside for a pre-baby vacation. Anybody ever gone on a pre-baby vacation? Well, my wife's like, yeah, this is the thing people do. It was our first child. He was due in August, and she's like, let's go on a vacation. I'm like, well, the baby's due like any moment, like any week, like this could happen. And she's like, let's go to Florida. I'm like, okay. So we're driving down here, and we're on the way, and the whole 9-month process, like I was never really worried about it. Like I was excited about being a dad, and I was excited. I didn't really like putting the crib together and all that stuff, but I just kind of was along for the ride. And we start driving. The long drive from Jonesboro, Arkansas to here. It took us around 8 or 9 hours. Depending on stops. And when she's pregnant, we stop a lot. But on the way here, like it started to hit me. Like, oh no, like we're about to be like parents. Like we're going to have a living thing with us all the time. And it's not like a dog where we could just let it go or, just like we've got to keep this thing no matter what. And I started freaking out. Like I really started to freak out. Like I was gripping the steering wheel and the whole way, like I lost like 6 pounds just from sweating. And I was like, I don't know what to do. Like, I've had this idea of being a dad for so long. Like, I can't wait to do this. I'm looking forward to, we were going to have a boy and thinking about all the cool boy things that we were going to do. And then when the reality hit me of like, what am I expected to do? Like, I've got some real big expectations here. And I was like, I don't know how to handle it. Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And my mind was filling with all these doubts and questions. And I think about that, and I think about us in our Christian walk, in our Christian lives, because a lot of times, when you're a kid, and a lot of Christians, became Christians when they were kids. They go through a youth group, and they go on these trips, and they hear about Christianity, and you sing these cool songs, and you hear these cool speakers, and like, yeah, I want to do this. Like, I want to be a part of this. And then you go through the process and you become a Christian, and then you're like, all right, now what? Like, what am I supposed to do with all of this? Like, what are my expectations? And so this morning we're going to look at Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1. Verse 1 of Ephesians chapter 4, Paul is writing to the church of Ephesus, and he says to them, therefore I, a prisoner for serving the Lord, beg you to lead a life, catch this, worthy of your calling. Now think about that really quickly. Lead a life worthy of your calling. Now Paul is writing to the Gentiles. He wrote and did a lot of his ministry to the Gentiles who were not Jewish. They didn't know a whole lot about God. They had heard about the Jewish people, they knew about the Jewish people, and they knew about what was going on, but they weren't really sure what they were supposed to do with it. And if we're honest with ourselves, a lot of times as Christians, we spend our lives trying to like, where do I fit in with all of this? yeah, we're members at a church, and we give to the collection plate every now and again, and we'll serve and we'll greet, and we might teach a Bible class here and there, but like, where do I really fit in? Like, what's my calling? Have you ever heard that phrase? Like, what's your calling in life? You know, we phrase that in a lot of different ways. You know, we ask kids all the time, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? I'm 34, I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. And I'm sure there's a lot of you that are still trying to figure that out. Like, where do I fit in this world? And people make lots and lots of money selling self-help books to try to help you figure out where you're going to be. And here we have Paul telling this church, he's like, I beg you to lead a life, to live your best life worthy of your calling, for you have been called by God. Now, what does it mean to be called by God? What does it mean to be called? Like, when I think about calling, I think about calling somebody up. You know, have you ever had those awkward conversations or those awkward phone calls where someone calls you to do something and you don't really want to do it? I'll tell you a story. My wife and I, we knew each other for several years. You know, we'd known each other for a long time before we ever went on a date. And I was living in Texas and she was, you know, back in Tennessee, and I was moving back, and we started texting, you know, like, hey girl, what's up? And you know, we're talking, and like, I'm like, man, I really like this girl. I want to take her on a date. And so she agrees. I don't know why. I guess I'm just a smooth talker or something. But she agrees to me to go on a date. So we go to a concert. Like, we're meeting in Memphis to go to a concert. It was OAR. I don't know if any of you know who OAR are, you know, whatever. Anyway, so we're going to this concert, and so we meet at the church building. Like, it was where I went to church, and I didn't live there. I lived like about 45 minutes away, and she was still in school, and so she was living on campus, so she lived about an hour away, and so we meet there. We get there, we go to the concert, it's a lot of fun, it's late, we get back, you know, I drop her off, we hug, and, you know, it's awkward for a little bit, and then we go our separate ways. And so it was good, but I get home, and it's super late, I'm exhausted, I hit my bed and my pillow, and the next thing I know, my phone starts ringing. And I answer it, and it's like a random number, and it's Bethany, who's my wife, by the way. And she's calling from some stranger's phone at Sonic. And it turns out that in the whole commotion, she had left her phone in my car. And I had to drive back in the middle of the night and give her her phone. And so that's one of those phone calls, and I'm sitting there thinking, I like this girl, but do I really want to get out of bed right now and go do this? And so sometimes we get these callings in life where we're like just not sure how to answer it. We're not sure what to do with it. And so this morning, I want us to look at the story of Moses. We're going to look at the story of Moses, mainly the first part of his life, and look at how he answered the call. Because I firmly believe, just speaking from my life and my experience, is that by answering this question, by figuring this out, how do we answer the call of God, it'll shape our lives, it'll shape our families, it'll shape our work, it'll shape our churches, it'll shape your local church, your community, because we all showed up to church this morning with a desire to be in a better relationship with God. And a lot of times we just need help figuring that out. And that's what's so great and so powerful about the Bible and the stories that are in it, is that we can learn from it and help that to teach us as we're living our life. So we look at Exodus chapter 2. In Exodus chapter 2, we start and we begin with Moses' life when he is conceived, when his mother is pregnant with him. And so at this time in life, you know, all the Jews had fled to, or not fled, but came to Egypt because of Joseph and the famine, and that led for many, many years. And all of the Jewish population was in Egypt, and they were their numbers were climbing. And Pharaoh realized that the Jews were starting to outnumber the Egyptians. And so he was starting to get a little worried, thinking, look, if all these Jews want to, like, you know, get a little wild on us, they could take us over. And so what he does is he took advantage of his power and passed a law that says, all right, any boy born under this age limit from here on out, you've got to be killed. And so Moses' mother knew that. And what it says, and what's very interesting, if you look in Exodus chapter 2, it says that when Moses' mother was pregnant with Moses, she knew that he was special. Now let's be honest, how many moms don't think that their kid's special? Like, this is a special baby. I mean, like, moms do weird things with kids. Like, you just do. But that's okay, because it's important that you think your kid's special. But Moses' mother knew that Moses was special, so she went against the trend. She kept him. And she kept him for 3 months until there was a time where she's like, look, I cannot keep this child any longer. I've got to do something, otherwise they're going to come and take him. And so what she did is something that I cannot, as a father, wrap my mind around him. She put him in a basket and sent him down a river. And not only just any river, the Nile River, which is not just this little creek that runs around behind your house. Like, this is a large, giant river. She, like, think about it, people. She stuck her baby in a basket and put it in the river. People get arrested for leaving their dog in the car. Like, this is a serious thing. But that's the first part of the step of finding your calling. The first thing that we have to understand, and the thing that we have to do before anything else will work, is we've got to be willing to let go. Let go of what we think is special. Because all of us in our lives, all of us wherever we are right now, wherever you are in your financial status, wherever you are in your relationship, wherever you are in your schooling, whatever it is phase of life you're in, you have things that you feel like you cannot let go of. I've spent my life working towards this. I've spent my money, my effort, everything about my life has gotten me to this. This is what I want. This is what is special. But in order for God to get us where we need to go and get us to where He wants us, we've got to be able to look at the things that are special in our lives and let those go. Now, that's a whole lot easier said than done, but how do you do that? How do you let go of what is valuable? Well, you have to begin it with faith. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 gives us the definition of faith, and it says that faith is being able to be confident in things that we cannot see and that they will be taken care of. Moses' mother took her child and put it in a basket knowing that that basket was going to go down the river. It was going to go from one point to another, and she had faith that wherever it was going to end up, it was going to be taken care of. And now for us, we have hindsight. We get to know what happens. But in the moment of that time, like you can imagine, the hardest step that she had to take was the letting go process. But what is it that you need to let go of? You're going to have to take a serious look at your life right now and say, okay, what in my life is keeping me from answering the call of God? Because if Moses' mother didn't let him go, what would have happened? What would have happened to the nation of Israel? Would we be here today? Those are all questions that I can't answer, but it's all started with letting go. So the first step to answering the call that we have in this life, to answering the call that God, the calling that we are worthy of, is we first have to let go. The second thing that we have to do as we continue looking at the story of Moses is to be still. Now, we've got a 2-year-old. I love him to death. I love our 2-year-old. He's so much fun. But one of the hardest things I figured out to do with a 2-year-old is get them to be still. Like, it is. Like, it's so tough to get a 2-year-old to be still. And I'm sure I'm looking around, there's kids, they just like to move. You know, they just get to fidgeting. And then, like, I'm not dancing, don't worry about it. So, because I can't dance, so it just doesn't matter. So they just do. Like, it's so fun because we'll be sitting in church and he'll just sit there and he just has to get up and he has to move. And like, we've got this little table that, you know, his aunt, Laurel, got for him, this little bitty table. And we'll let him eat there. Like, that's where we kind of get this big kid table, but for a little kid. And so we'll sit him there and I'll fix his lunch or I'll fix his dinner or I'll fix whatever. And we'll sit there and I'll even try to sit in the awkwardly small chair with him to get him to stay there. But he cannot. Like, he's just eating on the go, and I guess he gets it from his mom. But he is, like, just going constantly. And yeah, it's funny to think about 2-year-olds and the way they go, but let's be honest, we're the same way. Like, our lives are so full and so busy, and we're constantly doing and we're constantly going. I mean, we could all pull out our phones and our calendars, and we've got things that we're thinking of. You right now are not even listening to me. You're thinking about what's for lunch and how we're going to get to the beach and how we're not going to cough our lungs out. Like, how we're just going and going and going in our lives. But when we look at Moses and we look at the life that he was called to fulfill, the call that God gave him, it took a time for his life for him to be still. So we know when we continue in the story of Moses that Moses' mother put him in a basket and sent him down the river. Well, she let go, and by doing so, Pharaoh's daughter picked up the baby. So she found the baby, she took it, and she cared for it, and she, luckily for Moses' mother, she went back to Moses' mother so that Moses' mother could wean the child and get it to where she could, the baby could eat on its own. And then Moses grew up. And so Moses becomes a young man as we continue on the story in Exodus chapter 2. And while he's a young man, he's starting to get this itching inside of him. He realizes that he's different, that he's not an Egyptian, that he is from this tribe of Jewish people. And he wanders out and he sees an Egyptian beating up on a slave. And it hits him. He's like, man, these are my people. And so in this moment, Moses feels like, I've got to do something about this. And then the way that the story goes, Moses hits the Egyptian, kills him, freaks out, and buries him in the desert. And so now Moses is sitting here, he's conflicted because he's trying to do what he thinks is right, but he realized he rushed into it, and now he's had to cover it up and try to retrace his steps and try to figure out what to do next. And then the next day, or a few days later, we realize that, and we hear in the story that Moses is walking among his people, and two of the Jewish people, slaves, are fighting. And Moses approaches him. He's like, what are you guys doing? He's like, why are you fighting each other? Why is brother fighting brother? And they said, oh, Moses, the prince, what are you going to do? You're going to kill us like you did the Egyptian slave driver? So Moses freaks, and he does what any smart person does when they freak out. He ran away. And when he ran away, he ran off to a foreign land where he met this family and this father named Jethro. And what we get lost in the stories when we read in the Bible is that we read a story about Exodus chapter 2, and we can cover that in a page. But what we fail to realize is from the time that Moses left Egypt and ran off to the time that he was called later, spanned 40 years. And we don't know much about his life in that 40 years. All that we know is that he ran off, he got married, he had a few kids, he named them after God, and God's chosen, and so on and so forth. But that's all we know, that he was just a shepherd for 40 years. But see, what happened is, and what I believe in the way that it's laid out, is that in that 40 years, Moses needed some time to grow up and to learn and be disciplined by the world, disciplined by what it means to be a shepherd. Because I think it's interesting that Moses went off to be a shepherd, and we know what a shepherd is. They're guiding and leading sheep. And what did Moses end up doing? He shepherded people. And it took 40 years for Moses to learn what it meant to be a shepherd. Because remember, where did Moses come from? He was a prince in a Pharaoh's palace, where he didn't know how to work. He didn't know how to really do what was needed of him at that time. It took 40 years of learning how to be a shepherd for him to actually shepherd people. And see, what we want in this world today is we're so full of instant gratification. Like, we want things now. We want it when we want it, how we want it, the way that we want it, and we want it when we want it. All the time. And so we take that and we correlate it to our relationship with God. We say, like, look, God, I'm a good person. I showed up to church this morning. I gave some money in the plate. I want what I want now. And a lot of times we don't realize is God sitting there thinking, look, I need you to grow a little bit. I need you to learn a little bit before I can get you to where I want you to be. And so one of the hardest parts of this whole listening to God's calling is to be still, to just stop. Stop trying. Stop trying to force the issue. And I'm going to tell you right now, my confession to you this morning is I struggle with that. I'm a bit of a control freak. I like to be in control of my life. I want to do things how I want it, when I want it. And one of the hardest things I've had to do is just stop and say, all right, God, I'm giving this to you. I'm not going to force the issue, and I need it to you. And it's funny how that works. There's a lady at church where we attend, and I've talked to her a little bit about this because we were sitting talking one day, and she was telling me about her prayer life and all that. And she's like, I tried so hard to get the job that I wanted. I lost my job, and I was trying to force the issue. And I said, you know what? Forget it. I'm going to stop, and I'm going to pray. And I'm not going to look for another job. I'm not going to, God's going to take care of it. And no lie, she's like, it literally took a day. Now, it's not always going to be this way. And I got a phone call the next day with a job offer that I wanted. And so sometimes we just have to be able to let go and be still. Be in the moment. Be where you are right now in your life, because we don't know and we might not realize that this moment, wherever you are right now, whatever struggle you might be going through, whatever frustration you're dealing with is building you and teaching you and preparing you to get to where you want to be. One of my good friends is a minister. He's not a full-time minister anymore, but he was for a very long time. And he left ministry to go work in the business world. He left ministry to go work in the business world, and he hated it. Like, it really frustrated him a lot. And he spent 5 years working in a business. And it was just a random business, and he would talk to me all the time about, like, man, I just don't like this. It's really frustrating. It's not letting me do what I want to do, which is ministry, and it was just eating at him. And recently, this year, he just got his dream job. He works for another business, but it's a Christian business. It's a Christian radio station out of Nashville. And I talked to him. I was like, what do you think of your new job? He's like, dude, you have no idea how awesome it is. I'm going to tell you right now, I could not do this job if it wasn't for the 5 years I spent in this other job. He's like, that 5 years in this business taught me how to be a business person, and there was no way I could do what I do now if it wasn't for that. And it's a God thing. And so sometimes we have to be able to just stop and be in the moment. Be where we are, be still, and allow God to work through us to get us to where He wants to go. So the first thing that we have to do in order to answer God's call is to first, let go. Second, be still. Just be in the moment. The third thing, as we continue through the story of Moses, is that we know that now that Moses is, in Exodus chapter 2, that he is a shepherd, and he's out one day with his father-in-law Jethro. And they're sending the sheep, and he comes across Mount Sinai. We move into Exodus chapter 3. And he comes across to Mount Sinai, and in Mount Sinai, he notices something in the distance. And when you read Exodus chapter 3, we see that an angel sets a bush on fire. And why God needed to use an angel to set a bush on fire, I don't know, but that's what He did. And that's God, and God's cool, and He does what He wants to do. So He sets a bush on fire, and the bush doesn't burn up. Okay, so the bush is on fire, but it's not burning up. And Moses sees it, and he's curious about it. And we know that Moses goes to the bush, and as he approaches the bush, God speaks to him from the bush. And when God speaks to him from the bush, that's where God gives Moses his calling. He tells him, he's like, Moses, now that you have been here, I need you to go back to Egypt. I need you to let my people go. He's like, I need you to take the Jewish people and take them to the promised land that I promised their forefather Abraham. Take them there. And then we know the story, and that Moses is like, well, God, I don't know. And they kind of go back and forth, and God gives him some signs and lets him turn his staff into a snake, which I think, God, give me a cooler sign. I don't want a snake in my hand. Like, give me something. Let me do magic or something. But anyways, so we know that, but the part that I want to point out to the fact is that God used a burning bush to draw Moses' attention to a sign, to him to talk to him. Now, we know God, if you read the Bible, if you have any sort of Bible experience, reading the stories, hearing about the stories, God created this world. He created everything in it. When God wants to speak, He speaks. That's just the way it is. When God wants to do, He does. So why did God use a burning bush to speak to Moses? Well, He needed to get his attention. Because so often in our lives, we get to going throughout our lives, and we're starting to work, and we're doing our thing, and Moses was working. He was doing his job as a shepherd, and God needed to get his attention. Now, again, God can get his attention any way He wants. He could have slapped or screamed. He could have done anything, because it's God. But God used a burning bush so that Moses would approach the bush, and that he would come to God so that God could speak to him. And so the third thing that I'd like to point out to you for us to answer God's call is to be on the lookout for your burning bush. Because see, God is, when He is ready for you, when He is ready for you to call to action, when He's ready for you to do the thing that He wants you to do in this life, He's going to give you a sign. Now, I'm not standing up here and saying that God's going to speak to us from any sort of object. The audible voice of God is, I haven't heard it. And I know that things happen in this life that I can't explain, but I do know that God speaks to us in so many different ways. He speaks to us through people. I would never be standing on this stage if it wasn't for the people in my life that encouraged me to do it. I was terrified of being a guy who stand up in a pulpit to be a preacher. I was like, that's not me. That's not the kind of person I'm me. But it took lots and lots of people in my life to speak to me, to encourage me. It's like, okay, God, I'm starting to get the sign that you want me to try this out. In so many different ways that God will use things in our lives to get us to go in a direction, to get us to look at Him, to listen to His call and say, okay, God, maybe I should pay attention now. Now, the hard part about that is it's not always something nice. God doesn't always use nice, cool, magical things to get our attention. Sometimes He uses painful things. There are many times that I can think about in my life and other people's lives where God has used pain to get our attention. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a death in a family push and pull a family closer to God. Sometimes that happens in order for God to get our attention. Because one of the things that we're bad about as people is our attention span. Like we have a hard time staying focused. We have a hard time, being in the moment and allowing outside influences to get our attention. And so God's going to do anything He can in any way that He can to get your attention, because God, the one thing that we know about God is God loves you so much. Psalm 43 verse 7 says that God created us for His glory. God's whole intention for you is to glorify Him. He cares so much about each and every one of you that He wants nothing more for you to glorify Him. And that's what God has called us to do. But it's hard. It's a struggle. It's something that we spend most of our lives trying to figure out. And when you think about it, what have you been doing? For those of you that are 40 and over, what have you been doing for the last 40 years? It took Moses over 40 years to be able to answer the call that God gave him. I think it's interesting that Jesus didn't start His ministry until He was 30. I think He's Jesus. He could have been a teenager changing the world, but no, He waited until He was 30. Now, a part of that is because a lot of Jewish people didn't believe you were capable of teaching or being a true adult until you hit the age of 30. And so that's kind of what a lot of people believe. Jesus waited till He was 30 to do that. But He can work at any phase in your life. So as we're looking out for the burning bush, we see stories all throughout the Bible of God using strange and unique things to get His people where He wanted them. I love the story of Jonah. It's kind of weird to think about, but we hear the story of Jonah where God called Jonah to go to the city to spread the good news about God, to change a king and to change a city because they were evil. And Jonah did what a lot of us normally do. He ran the other way. And so in the process of running the other way, God sent this giant storm and everybody started freaking out, and it was going to capsize the boat and kill everybody. And Jonah admitted, hey, it's me that God is doing this because of. And so they threw him overboard. And what happens to Jonah next? He gets swallowed by a great fish, which is probably one of the most disgusting things that could happen to a person. He gets swallowed by a great fish. But what's so interesting about that story is that when the fish swallowed Jonah, what happened? Jonah's perception changed. He started praying to God, asking for forgiveness, asking for the opportunity to do what God had called him to do. And then what happens after that? The fish spit him out onto dry ground. But where did the fish spit him out? At his destination. The fish was the tool to get Jonah where he needed to be. And it took the fish swallowing Jonah for Jonah to realize that. Now, you want to talk about things that happen in your life that aren't that great or bad? Imagine living in a fish for a little while. But a lot of times that's what happens in our lives is God uses a giant, nasty fish to swallow you up just to get you to where you need to be. And it took that fish for Jonah to realize that. We hear stories all the time about the way in which God works, and so often we want to use God as our personal genie or our tool to benefit our life. But that's not why we were created. Ephesians 4 tells us that, therefore I, a prisoner serving the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of your calling, for you have been called by God. Paul uses this phrase a lot. If you go through Paul's writing, he says it in 1 Thessalonians, he says it in, or 2 Thessalonians, he says it in 1 Timothy. He uses this phrase a lot because Paul got it. He knew what he was here for. You want to talk about someone having a calling, a burning bush moment? Think about Paul, who was Saul. How did his life change? Saul was a persecutor of Christians. He spent his life in the Jewish temple learning what it meant to be the best Jew possible. And in doing that, he knew that he had to persecute Christians. And on his way to Damascus, God came to him and blinded him in order to get his attention. Are you willing to let God blind you to get your attention? That's a hard answer. That's a hard question to answer. But I am. I'm going through struggles right now in my life. I'm going to go through more. But I know that that's God's way of molding me and getting me to where I need to be. And I can only speak for myself. And that's why I share this with you this morning in hopes that through God's Word and the way that God speaks and the way that God shares with us, that you will be able to hope and learn and try to get to where you are. Because what's the point of living this life and doing all the things that we do in it if we're not really glorifying God at the end of it? There's no reason for it. We're wasting our life. You read through the whole book of Ecclesiastes and you hear Solomon, who had everything. He said, this life is nothing but vain if it doesn't have God in it. So this morning, I want to challenge you. I want to challenge you to take a moment and to let go or think about what you need to let go of that's keeping you from starting and getting your child and getting yourself down the river. Because if it wasn't for letting go, Moses would have never ended up where he was. I want to challenge you to be still. Think about what you're trying to be and where you're trying to go and just stop for a moment and say, look, let's just be in this moment. Have a conversation with your husband. Have a conversation with your wife and your kids and say, look, we're just going to be here right now and just let God use us where we are. And that's hard. It's hard to think, okay, because we all want to be wherever it is that we want to be in life. And think about where you're at right now in your church, in your home church, in your home community. How can God use you there? God used Moses there to influence people with his father-in-law Jethro. He used him there as a shepherd. Where can God use you right now? And thirdly, be on the lookout for your burning bush. Look at the signs. Look at the things that are happening in your life, the things that are happening around, and say, okay, maybe God's trying to get my attention. Maybe God's trying to tell me something here. Maybe he's trying to push me and speak to me. God's call will always draw you closer to him so that God can tell you and send you where he wants you to go. Everything that happens in your life, every major event, whatever it is a lot of times God's way of getting you to be closer to him. I love the book Crazy Love by Francis Chan, and it changed my perspective on prayer. How many of you said a prayer for safety on your trip to Destin before you came? A lot of you do that. Like, that's kind of what we do. Like, we always want to be safe. We always want to be taken care of. And in this book, Francis Chan writes, he's like, we do this all the time. We pray for safety. And he's like, well, what if something bad needs to happen to get us closer to God? He says, so what he did is he changed the way that he prays. He's like, no longer do I pray for safety and all these things. He goes, I want that, but my prayer has changed that God, whatever happens, I pray that this makes me closer to you. That's a hard prayer to pray. Because a lot of times things that can happen that we don't really like, but we need that in our lives to get us closer to God. This morning, I share with you this story from Moses, and I encourage you in the way that Paul encouraged the church of Ephesus to live a life. I beg you, and I beg you this morning, to lead a life worthy of your calling. For you have been called by God. You have been called to glorify him and to change this world, to do it in the name of Christ. I cannot tell you how amazing it is to try to do things for God and to see it work out, to do ministry and to do things for others, to feel called, to know that you have a purpose, to know that the expectation of you is being fulfilled. It's such a great and amazing feeling, and I cannot tell you how bad, and I cannot beg you enough to let it go, to be still, and to look for your bush. Let's pray. Lord Father, I thank you for today. I thank you for all that you do and all that you are. I thank you for the ways in which you bless us. Lord, right now we're all living our lives to the best of our ability, but sometimes a lot of times we need your help to get us to where we need to be. I pray, Lord, that we can let go of whatever it is that we need to let go of to get us on the right track. I pray, Lord, that we can be still in this moment and wherever our path